In the middle of World War II, when the world was on fire and millions of soldiers fought across Europe, the United States created a secret army unlike anything before. It wasn't built on brute force. It wasn't formed from hardened killers or decorated generals. Instead, it was an army of deception, an army of illusion. These men carried paintbrushes instead of rifles. They inflated tanks made of rubber instead of rolling out steel. They blasted sound recordings instead of firing artillery. And yet, with little more than trickery and imagination, they fooled the Nazis again and again. For decades, their existence remained hidden. The men who fought in this army never spoke of it. Their operations were locked away as classified secrets. But today, we can finally tell their story. A story of artists and dreamers dressed as soldiers who walked into the deadliest war in history to fight with nothing but creativity and nerve. They were called the Ghost Army. By 1943, the Allies had momentum, but also a massive problem. The Nazis were dug in across Europe, fortified in towns and cities, waiting for every Allied move. Every battle threatened to become a slaughter if the Germans could predict where the next strike would fall. The High Command needed a new weapon, not another bomb or division of tanks, but a way to mislead the enemy. They needed to make the Germans believe that American armies were massing in one place, when in truth, the real attack was being prepared somewhere else. And so, an idea took shape. A sleight of hand, a stage magician's trick, but played out on the battlefields of Europe. To pull it off, the U.S. Army did something extraordinary. They didn't recruit from West Point or the hardened ranks of combat veterans. They went to art schools, advertising agencies, and Broadway theaters. They recruited men who knew how to paint, how to design, how to perform, and how to manipulate perception. Imagine being a young painter at an art academy, sketching portraits one day, and the next, being told you'd be using your skills to paint camouflage nets that could fool enemy reconnaissance planes. Or picture a sound engineer, once recording jazz bands in a smoky club, now capturing the roar of Sherman tanks and the rumble of artillery, sounds that would later be blasted across the French countryside to terrify German troops. This strange collection of talent came together as the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. But inside, everyone knew the nickname that stuck, the Ghost Army. From the very beginning, their mission was clear. They were not to fight head-on. They were to mislead, to confuse, to deceive, to make the Germans believe in armies that didn't exist, to force them to spread their defenses thin, to make them fight shadows. The tricks were as bold as they were brilliant. Inflatable tanks, life-sized and realistic, could be set up in a muddy field in less than an hour. At a distance, through a pair of binoculars, there was no way to tell that these hulking machines were nothing but air and rubber. Massive speakers mounted on trucks blasted the recorded sounds of entire armored divisions, tracks grinding, engines roaring, men shouting orders. The sound was so real it carried for miles, echoing across hills and rivers. Radio operators created fake transmissions, full of codes and call signs designed for German intelligence to intercept. And then there were the actors, young soldiers dressing up as colonels, walking into French villages, dropping hints in cafes where German spies might be listening. Every action, every detail, was part of the performance. This was war turned into theater, and the Nazis were the audience. Their first real test came after D-Day in June 1944. The Allies had stormed the beaches of Normandy, but the fight for France was far from over. The Ghost Army was called into action to create the illusion of massive American forces moving into areas where, in reality, there were none. Under cover of darkness, they rolled out their rubber tanks and artillery. By dawn, entire divisions appeared to have sprung up from the earth overnight. Loudspeakers filled the air with the terrifying sound of approaching armored columns. Radio messages crackled with orders and coordinates, all designed to be overheard by German ears. To anyone watching, it looked, sounded, and even felt like an army of thousands. The Germans believed it. They moved their forces to counter an enemy that didn't exist, leaving other areas exposed. And when the real American divisions attacked, they found weakened defenses, saving countless lives. But for the men of the Ghost Army, this wasn't just clever trickery. It was a dangerous game. They operated close to the front lines, sometimes only a few miles from Nazi positions. They carried only light weapons and had little protection. If the Germans ever realized they were fakes, if they attacked with real force, the Ghost Army would be wiped out in minutes. One veteran later admitted, "If the Germans had ever hit us hard, we wouldn't have stood a chance." Their survival depended entirely on the strength of their illusions. Many of the soldiers would later become famous in other ways. Bill Blass, who went on to be one of America's top fashion designers. Arthur Singer, who became a renowned wildlife illustrator. Others returned to quieter lives as teachers, architects, and designers. But during the war, all of them were united by one thing: turning art into a weapon. At night, after setting up their phantom divisions, many of them still returned to their sketchbooks. They drew the war around them. The faces of refugees, the ruined buildings of Europe, the strange sight of rubber tanks looming in fields under moonlight. For them, deception was both survival and expression. Their work was so secret that most Allied soldiers had no idea they existed. Sometimes, real combat troops stumbled across a field full of inflatable tanks and burst out laughing, only to be quickly silenced and sworn to secrecy. The truth of the Ghost Army was locked away. Their photographs, their sketches, their stories, all classified for decades. What made them so effective wasn't just the tools they used, but the psychology behind it. War isn't only about bullets and bombs. It's about perception. If you can make your enemy believe something, that belief is just as powerful as reality. A German general staring through binoculars at a field of tanks didn't have the luxury of assuming they were fake. A German intelligence officer listening to intercepted radio chatter couldn't risk dismissing it as a trick. The Ghost Army exploited fear, doubt, and uncertainty. They made the enemy question everything. And in war, hesitation can mean defeat. By the fall of 1944, the Ghost Army had already pulled off several successful operations. They had created phantom divisions, drawn enemy troops away from real battlefields, and saved thousands of American soldiers. But as the war dragged on and the fighting grew fiercer, the challenges became greater. The Germans were learning. They were becoming suspicious. The illusions would have to be bigger, bolder, and even more dangerous. The stage was set for their greatest performances. The moments where a few hundred artists and engineers would hold the line against tens of thousands of German troops, armed with nothing but rubber, sound, and imagination. The Ghost Army had proven themselves. But the most daring illusions were still to come. The Ghost Army had proven that illusions could work, but the war was far from over. Each new mission demanded bigger, bolder deceptions. Their rubber tanks, fake radio chatter, and booming sound effects were no longer just experiments. They were weapons, tools as vital as guns or bombs. By late 1944, the Ghost Army was being sent into some of the most dangerous missions of the European campaign. They were asked to do the impossible, to convince the Germans that an entire American division stood in their path, even when only a few hundred men were really there. The unit operated like a traveling roadshow of war. They could pack up an entire fake army, load it into trucks, and move overnight to a new location. Within hours, open fields were suddenly filled with rows of Sherman tanks, artillery guns, and jeeps, all made of inflatable rubber. Soldiers became stagehands, pumping air into massive canvas shells, dragging them into position, arranging them in perfect formation so that, from a distance, it looked like a formidable force. Every detail mattered. Tire tracks were carved into the mud to make it look like heavy vehicles had passed. Campfires were lit at night to suggest hundreds of men bedding down. Laundry was hung on lines to mimic daily life. It was theater on a grand scale. But sight alone wasn't enough. Sound was just as important. The Ghost Army had sound crews equipped with some of the most advanced audio technology of the time. They carried massive speakers on half-tracks, blasting recordings of armored columns moving into position. These recordings had been made at Fort Knox, capturing every gear shift, every clank of metal, every roar of an engine. By layering and mixing these sounds, the engineers created the illusion of thousands of soldiers moving through the night. The noise carried for miles. To a German patrol hiding in the woods, it sounded terrifyingly real. And then there was the radio trickery. Expert operators spent hours mimicking the chatter of real units. They copied the style, the rhythm, even the mistakes of the divisions they impersonated. German intelligence listened eagerly, unaware they were being played like an audience at a magic show. Sometimes, deception went even further. Ghost Army soldiers dressed up as officers and walked into local towns, casually dropping hints in cafes, knowing German spies might be listening. A whispered comment about where troops were heading could ripple back to Nazi headquarters, reinforcing the illusion already in play. Each performance was risky. They worked so close to the front lines that German artillery could have struck at any moment. If the enemy discovered the truth, the Ghost Army would be wiped out. Their survival depended on one thing only: the believability of their lies. One of their most daring deceptions came in the summer of 1944, as the Allies pushed deeper into France. The Americans needed to cross the Seine River. If the Germans guessed the real location, they would destroy the bridges and trap the Allies. The Ghost Army staged a fake crossing. Inflatable tanks filled the fields. Loudspeakers rumbled through the night. Radios crackled with orders. The Germans bought it. They shifted their forces to the wrong place. And while they scrambled to face a phantom division, the real crossing succeeded with minimal resistance. Thousands of lives were saved. Another mission took place near the fortress city of Metz. The Ghost Army pretended to be multiple armored divisions preparing to strike from the north. They filled the countryside with rubber tanks, kept up the noise for days, and convinced the Germans to reinforce their northern defenses. When the real American attack came from the south, the defenses there were weak. Metz fell. Again and again, the ghosts succeeded. German commanders moved troops, wasted fuel, and spread their forces thin, chasing shadows. Each time the illusion worked, real American soldiers were spared. But the pressure was enormous. Inflatable tanks looked real from afar, but up close they were fragile shells. One curious German scout could ruin everything. Sound effects shook the night, but if enemy soldiers advanced, the truth would be revealed. Every operation was a gamble with their lives. And yet, through it all, they never lost their creativity. Some soldiers sketched cartoons of themselves inflating tanks like balloons. Others painted haunting portraits of ruined towns and exhausted refugees. Even in deception, they found ways to capture truth on paper. By late 1944, their reputation with an Allied command was secure. Whenever a diversion was needed, the Ghost Army was called. But the war wasn't over. Hitler's forces were preparing one last, desperate offensive. The stage was being set for the largest battle of the war, and soon, the Ghost Army would face its greatest challenge. A deception so bold, so dangerous, that discovery could mean disaster. The winter of 1944 was bitterly cold. Snow covered the forests and fields of Europe. The war seemed to be drawing toward its end. Hitler's armies were on the retreat. But then, in December, the Germans launched one last desperate strike. It was called the Ardennes Offensive. History remembers it as the Battle of the Bulge, a massive surprise attack, with tanks and troops crashing through the frozen forests of Belgium. American forces were caught off guard. Entire units were pushed back. Thousands were killed, captured, or forced to retreat. The Allies needed every advantage to stop the German advance. And so, once again, the Ghost Army was called to the stage. This was no ordinary mission. The situation was desperate. If the Germans broke through, they could split the Allied armies in half and prolong the war for months. The Ghost Army was ordered to create illusions that would hold off entire divisions of German troops. Just 1,100 men, standing against tens of thousands. They went to work in the snow, dragging rubber tanks into frozen fields, inflating them with icy breath showing in the cold air. They carved fresh tank tracks into the snow to make it look like heavy armor had moved in. Loudspeakers blasted the rumble of engines, the metallic clatter of soldiers on the move, the booming of artillery being positioned. Radio operators filled the air with fake transmissions, weaving a story of a powerful American counterattack that didn't exist. The risk was enormous. If the Germans realized it was a bluff, the Ghost Army would be destroyed. But the illusions worked. Nazi intelligence reports later revealed that German commanders had believed they were facing 2 full American divisions. In reality, they were staring at nothing more than rubber, sound, and imagination. That hesitation gave the Allies the time they needed to regroup and launch a real counterattack. Again, the Ghost Army had bought precious time with their lies. As the winter dragged on, the unit continued their work, staging deception after deception. One of their final and most daring operations took place in March 1945, near the Rhine River. The Rhine was the last great natural barrier before the heart of Germany. Crossing it would be dangerous. If the Germans concentrated their defenses at the crossing points, the Allies could be slaughtered. The Ghost Army's task was clear: make the Germans believe the crossing would happen far from the real location. They staged a massive show near the town of Wesel. Inflatable tanks and trucks filled the fields. Fake artillery pointed menacingly across the river. Radio chatter buzzed with the details of an upcoming assault. At night, loudspeakers filled the air with the grinding roar of armored divisions moving into position. They even sent small patrols across the river to fire weapons and make noise, all part of the act. Meanwhile, the real crossing happened miles away. The Germans had been fooled again. The Allies stormed across the Rhine, breaking into Germany and setting the stage for the final collapse of Hitler's empire. It was perhaps the Ghost Army's greatest triumph. But the men themselves rarely thought of glory. They knew how close they had come to death, how fragile their illusions were. One mistake, one German scout looking too closely, could have meant disaster. They lived every day on the knife's edge between life and death, armed with nothing but their wits. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. In May 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe came to an end. The men of the Ghost Army packed away their rubber tanks, silenced their radios, and shut down their speakers. Their strange, secret war was finished. But their story did not end with medals or parades. The Ghost Army's existence was classified. For decades, almost nobody outside the unit knew what they had done. Families were left in the dark. Even other soldiers who had fought alongside them never learned the truth. The men themselves were ordered to keep silent, and they did. It wasn't until the 1990s, nearly 50 years later, that the details of their operations finally began to emerge. Veterans of the Ghost Army, old men by then, began to share their memories. They revealed sketches, photographs, and diaries that had been hidden away for decades. The world learned of the secret army of artists who had fought with illusions instead of bullets. Many of them had gone on to remarkable careers. Bill Blass became one of the most famous fashion designers in America. Arthur Singer became a celebrated illustrator. Others became teachers, painters, and designers. But in their youth, they had been illusionists in uniform, ghosts who tricked the Nazis on the battlefields of Europe. Historians now estimate that their work saved tens of thousands of lives. Every time they created a phantom division, every time they lured German forces away from the real attack, they spared American soldiers from bloody battles. Their courage was not measured in how many enemies they killed, but in how many lives they saved. In a war defined by destruction, they fought with creation. For years, their contribution went unrecognized. But slowly, the truth has come to light. Exhibits now display their sketches, their photographs, even some of the inflatable tanks they used. Today, their story feels almost unbelievable. Artists and actors, sound engineers and radio men, dressed as soldiers and sent to the front lines, tricking one of the most dangerous armies in history. But it is real. Their illusions changed the course of battles. Their deceptions helped win the war. The Ghost Army reminds us that war is not only about strength. Sometimes, the sharpest weapon is imagination. They were painters. They were sculptors. They were musicians and dreamers. They carried rubber and wires instead of guns and bullets, yet they walked straight into danger, armed with nothing but creativity. And in the greatest performance of their lives, they helped bring down the Third Reich. They were never meant to be remembered, but now we know their name: the Ghost Army.